I always thought the worst wedding disaster would be pouring rain or a ruined dress. I never imagined the real threat was the woman claiming she only wanted the best for her daughter. My mother secretly canceled every vendor behind my back, turning my marriage into a pawn for her social game, but she never anticipated one thing. When she arrived to savor my humiliation, she walked straight into a room waiting with the absolute truth. I am Camille Lawrence. At 31 years old, I had built my entire existence around the delicate art of controlling chaos. As the senior brand experience director at Northvale Atelier in Charleston, South Carolina, my daily reality consisted of managing high-stakes corporate narratives, soothing neurotic clients, and putting out massive fires before anyone in the public ever smelled smoke. People in my industry knew me as the woman who never lost her cool under pressure. Whether a supplier went bankrupt 48 hours before a major product launch, or a chief executive officer made a catastrophic public misstep, I was the one who smoothed the jagged edges and curated absolute perfection. I was deeply accustomed to being the silent architect of other people's flawless realities. When it came to my own personal life, however, I craved the exact opposite of the manufactured glamour I sold to others. I was entirely exhausted by the polished, breathless veneers of the Charleston elite. That was precisely why I fell so deeply and completely in love with Everett Hale. At 34 years of age, Everett was a restoration architect who spent his days breathing life back into forgotten historical structures. He possessed a quiet, steadying strength that grounded me instantly. He was inherently kind, soft-spoken, and remarkably unpretentious. His hands were often calloused from working directly with reclaimed wood and centuries-old masonry. He did not care about the social currency of a prestigious zip code, the designer brand of a watch, or the exclusive guest list of a weekend gala. He just cared about what was real, honest, and enduring. For our wedding, we wanted a pure reflection of that quiet authenticity. We definitely did not want a sprawling country club ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers and suffocating legacy politics. Instead, we chose Halcyon Glass House. It was a stunning riverside conservatory, wrapped in heavy wrought iron and draped heavily in native Carolina jasmine that bloomed furiously in the thick southern heat. It felt incredibly luxurious, but fundamentally warm, flooded with brilliant natural light that turned a deep golden hue as the sun dipped below the water. It was the exact spirit I envisioned for our single most important day, elegant, profoundly private, and anchored in deep emotional resonance rather than shallow, loud spectacle. It was a place where we could actually hear each other speak. I poured my heart into the intimate details of the planning, focusing heavily on the menu. Instead of selecting standard, forgettable catering fare, I worked meticulously with an independent private chef to design specific courses inspired by the meals my late father used to love. I requested a delicate roasted coastal bass with charred lemon, alongside an intricate heirloom tomato tart that perfectly mirrored the humid summer dinners of my childhood. I wanted the evening to represent a beautiful, hopeful new beginning with Everett, while keeping a tangible, tender memory of the family I had lost. My father was a good, gentle man, and having his favorite flavors woven directly into the celebration felt like pulling a chair out for him at the head table. But then my mother stepped in. Vanessa Lawrence emerged from the quiet periphery of my adult life in a sudden whirlwind of overwhelming maternal devotion. For many long years following my father's passing, our relationship had been a frozen tundra of polite, highly guarded distance. We spoke briefly on major holidays, exchanged carefully chosen gift cards, and maintained a strict surface-level pleasantry that kept us from actually knowing each other. She had never been the kind of mother you call crying over a terrible day at work or a devastating heartbreak. Yet, the very moment the vintage engagement ring slid onto my finger, a strange switch flipped deep inside her. Vanessa transformed into the ideal mother of the bride seemingly overnight. She was incredibly energetic, suddenly appearing at my townhouse with thick binders and expensive swatches of imported silk. She constantly tapped into her extensive social network to connect us with elite, highly sought-after vendors. She eagerly offered to make the tedious phone calls, track down our massive financial deposits, and introduce us to people she insisted were the absolute best in the entire hospitality business. At first, my natural instinct was defensive. I wanted to fiercely protect the intimate boundary Everett and I had drawn around our relationship. But grief and lingering childhood longing have a funny way of making you entirely blind to the truth. I interpreted her sudden burst of intense involvement as a desperate, delayed attempt to finally heal our fractured relationship. I truly thought looking at wedding dresses and tasting expensive cake samples was her clumsy way of saying she finally wanted to be close to me. And so, against my better professional judgment, my heart softened. I let my guard down completely. I let her take the heavy reins on administrative tasks I normally would have handled myself with ruthless efficiency. Vanessa had a masterful, terrifying way of framing her overbearing behavior as acts of profound love and maternal sacrifice. She would wave away my quiet hesitations with a perfectly manicured hand, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she said, "I just want this day to be beautiful enough so no one can ever look down on you." At the time, I foolishly thought she meant she wanted to protect me from the harsh, whispering judgment of her wealthy peers. I did not realize she was actually talking about protecting herself. Everett, usually the most patient and observant man on earth, grew increasingly frustrated as the busy weeks turned into stressful months. He noticed how Vanessa subtly tried to micromanage every granular detail, from the exact thread count of the dinner napkins to the specific typography on the heavy invitation envelopes. He saw the sharp way she dismissed his design ideas if they did not align perfectly with her polished, high society vision. When he finally voiced his deep discomfort late one night in our kitchen, tracing the rim of his coffee mug with a tight jaw, I quickly brushed it off. I stroked his arm and gently reassured him that she was just excited to finally be part of my life. I told him my mother simply had a suffocating way of showing her love, and we just needed to endure her overwhelming presence for a little while longer. I was entirely wrong. I was too busy looking at the beautiful, supportive surface she was painting to see the toxic rot spreading rapidly underneath. The reality of her true intentions did not crystallize for me until it was far too late. Even though the warning signs were flashing right in my face, the clearest one happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Exactly the kind of quiet moment that haunts you later in hindsight. We were standing in my living room, looking over a sprawling physical mood board I had painstakingly put together for the reception space. Vanessa traced her finger along a dark velvet fabric swatch, her eyes suddenly reflecting a cold, calculating light that had absolutely nothing to do with maternal joy. She smiled at the board, not even looking at me, her voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper as she spoke. A wedding does not just create a new family, it also determines how the old family looks in the eyes of others. Everett and I originally envisioned an intimate gathering. We capped our guest list at exactly 90 people. It was meant to be a tightly curated group of individuals who actually knew us, people who had sat at our dinner table and shared a bottle of wine with us on a random Tuesday, but week by week, that list began to mutate. It started with a casual phone call from my mother, suggesting we add just a handful of extended relatives. Then it escalated. Before I could fully grasp the mathematical reality of what was happening, Vanessa had ballooned our head count to well over 200 attendees. Her justification was always delivered with a sigh of weary social obligation. She would tell me that people would be deeply offended if they were excluded. She insisted that in our circle, invitations were a currency of respect. But as I scrolled through the finalized spreadsheet, I barely recognized a single name in the added rows. These were not my childhood friends or Everett and his colleagues. They were wealthy donor couples from her various charity boards, her Tuesday morning golf partners, senior members of the local arts council, and a slew of affluent acquaintances I had never spoken a single word to in my entire 31 years of life. My quiet celebration was rapidly becoming her personal networking gala. The guest list was only the beginning of her silent takeover. The financial logistics came next. Weddings require a labyrinth of deposits, retainers, and staggered payment schedules. Vanessa approached me one afternoon with a perfectly reasonable-sounding proposition. She suggested that she should put her name on the primary contracts and handle the outward flow of money, Her logic seemed flawless at the time. She claimed she possessed superior relationships with the premier vendors in the city and could leverage those connections for better service. She also argued that running everything through her premium credit card would make the accounting infinitely easier to track. I was deeply submerged in a grueling branding campaign at North Vale Atelier at the time, working 60-hour weeks, so handing over the administrative burden felt like a massive relief. I agreed. I let her hold the purse strings. Almost immediately, the aesthetic of the wedding began to shift. The changes were incremental at first, disguised as minor upgrades, but they quickly accumulated into a complete overhaul of my original vision. The soft, muted wildflowers I had chosen for the centerpieces were abruptly swapped out. Vanessa declared the original color palette looked too immature and replaced them with towering, aggressive arrangements of imported white orchids. The acoustic string quartet Everett and I had hired to play indie folk covers was dismissed because they were not classy enough for an evening affair. In their place, a 12-piece classical ensemble was booked. Even the tables were changed. The long family-style wooden farmhouse tables we loved were swapped for round banquet tables, draped in heavy floor-length silk. When I questioned the shift, she simply patted my hand and stated that the rustic look did not resemble a Lawrence family wedding. Underneath all the floral upgrades and guest list expansions, there was a much darker current flowing through her actions. Vanessa had always harbored a profound, barely concealed disdain for Everett. It was not because he was unkind or unsuccessful. In fact, his reputation as a restoration architect was impeccable. The problem was that he did not come from generational wealth. He did not possess a trust fund, a recognizable family name, or the kind of flashy, aggressive ambition she valued. He worked with his hands. He wore faded flannel shirts on the weekends. He was, in her eyes, ordinary. She never attacked him directly. That was not her style. Vanessa dealt exclusively in the currency of plausible deniability. She specialized in dropping quiet, devastating remarks that were engineered to inflict maximum insecurity while allowing her to retreat into a posture of innocent concern if challenged. We would be having lunch, and out of nowhere, she would carefully place her fork down, look at me with sorrowful eyes, and say that Everett is a remarkably good man. But she was just not sure he truly understood the complex world I was stepping into. She planted those tiny seeds of doubt constantly, hoping one would eventually take root and choke the life out of my relationship. I absorbed it all. I swallowed my frustration and continuously yielded to her demands. I convinced myself that weddings simply made people crazy, particularly mothers who placed too much value on societal optics. I desperately reasoned that if I just survived this suffocating period of tension, if I just let her have the orchids and the string ensemble and the 200 strangers, she would eventually be satisfied. I believed that once the vows were spoken and the night ended, Everett and I would finally be left alone to live our lives. I was profoundly naive, but thankfully, Rowan Bell was not. Rowan was my maid of honor, my closest friend since our freshman year of college, and a seasoned professional in the high-end event production industry. She engineered multi-million-dollar corporate retreats and lavish celebrity galas for a living. She understood the intricate machinery of large-scale events better than anyone I knew. While I was busy making excuses for my mother, Rowan was silently watching the exact mechanics of Vanessa and her takeover. Rowan possessed a terrifyingly sharp eye for logistical vulnerabilities. She noticed the pattern immediately. Vanessa was systematically consolidating every single point of access. All the critical paperwork, the master timelines, the signed contracts, and the direct lines of communication with the vendors were being funneled exclusively through my mother. I was the bride, yet I had zero direct contact with the people actually building my wedding. Rowan did not cause a scene. She did not corner me and demand that I confront my mother, knowing I was already stretched to my absolute emotional limit. Instead, she took quiet, decisive action. Operating entirely in the background, Rowan began building a shadow archive. She subtly reached out to the vendors under the guise of coordinating the bridal party schedule and managed to secure copies of the original contracts. She logged their direct mobile numbers, She mapped out the exact payment schedules and cancellation clauses. Rowan recognized what I could not bring myself to see. She was staring at a flawlessly painted wall, and she was the only person in the room who noticed the very first, dangerous crack forming near the foundation. Exactly 6 months before the wedding day, a very quiet shift occurred. I was entirely oblivious to it, buried under the crushing weight of a massive rebranding campaign at the agency. I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night and an endless stream of black coffee. But Rowan was not blind. Rowan made her living navigating the treacherous waters of high-stakes event production. She possessed an instinct for disaster that bordered on clairvoyance. She would later confess to me how the pieces began to fall into place during a routine vendor visit. Rowan had stopped by the floral design studio to review some towering centerpieces for one of her own corporate clients. While waiting in the foyer, the lead florist, looking incredibly frazzled, mentioned a confusing directive she had just received regarding my account. The florist turned her laptop monitor around to seek clarification. There, glowing on the screen, was a crisp email from Vanessa. The message explicitly instructed the design team to remove my email address from all future correspondence. My mother had requested that every single update, invoice, and design modification be routed exclusively through her private inbox. She claimed I was simply too overwhelmed with my corporate job to handle the stress of floral logistics. To an ordinary person, it might have looked like a mother trying to shield her exhausted daughter. But to Rowan, it was a massive, blaring siren. In the cutthroat world of elite event production, information is the ultimate currency. Rowan knew from bitter professional experience that whenever a single stakeholder aggressively attempts to silo the flow of communication, it is never out of kindness. It is always a calculated maneuver to control the final outcome. You do not blindfold the bride unless you are planning to take her somewhere she absolutely does not want to go. Rowan made a crucial decision that afternoon. She knew that bringing this discovery to me would only trigger a massive panic attack, and I was already stretched to my absolute emotional limit. Instead of sounding the alarm and causing chaos, Rowan did what she does best. She went into full crisis mitigation mode. She began constructing a shadow operation, an invisible safety net woven so tightly that if the floor suddenly gave way, I would not even hit the ground. She called it her contingency map. First, she needed a backup venue. This was the most difficult piece of the puzzle, as securing a premium space in Charleston just months prior to a weekend date was nearly impossible. But Rowan had deep industry leverage. She quietly placed a soft hold on Harbor Ledger Hall. It was a magnificent structure, a massive former ferry terminal perched right on the edge of the water. It had recently been acquired and restored, transforming the raw industrial skeleton of exposed brick and heavy steel beams into a breathtakingly elegant event space. It possessed a distinctly modern American industrial edge, yet the warm amber lighting and rich acoustic paneling made it feel incredibly intimate. Ironically, it was a space that perfectly married Everett and his architectural sensibilities with my deep need for authenticity. It was everything the glass house was, but with a stronger, older soul. Next, Rowan secured the personnel. She reached out to a fiercely independent executive chef who owed her a massive professional favor from 2 years prior, when she had salvaged a catastrophic catering failure at a tech summit. He agreed to remain on standby for our date, asking no questions. She then locked in a boutique wedding photography studio, known for their stealthy documentary-style approach, ensuring they could accommodate a sudden booking. She even mapped out alternative transportation routes and backup rental companies for chairs, tables, and linens. She built an entire ghost wedding in the background. But having the vendors was useless without a way to silently maneuver the guests. Rowan needed a closed-circuit communication system. She reached out to Everett and his younger sister, Mara Hale. Mara was a razor-sharp logistics manager for a supply chain firm, someone who possessed zero tolerance for nonsense and a terrifying efficiency with spreadsheets. Sworn to absolute secrecy, the three of them divided the 200 guest list into highly organized, distinct tiers. They drafted templated messages and assigned specific contact groups. If my mother managed to detonate the original plan, Mara and Everett could instantly deploy a coordinated update to every single essential guest within 15 minutes, redirecting them to a new location without sparking a chaotic public frenzy. While Rowan was building a fortress in the shadows, I was dealing with my mother and her escalating anxiety in the daylight. Vanessa was becoming increasingly unhinged about our chosen venue. As the weeks slipped by, her subtle complaints about the Riverside Conservatory morphed into aggressive, desperate demands. She constantly pressured me to abandon the glass house and move the entire reception to a highly exclusive, garishly opulent country club on the edge of the city. She argued that our venue was simply too rustic, too exposed, and fundamentally beneath our family standards. She claimed the country club was the only place fitting for a woman of my professional stature. When I firmly refused, citing our deposit and my deep love for the space, her reaction was not just annoyance, it was pure, frantic panic. I could not understand why she was so deeply rattled by a venue choice, but Rowan found the missing puzzle piece during a dress fitting. I was inside the dressing room, drowning in layers of heavy ivory silk, while Rowan waited in the private lounge area. Vanessa was pacing the hallway outside, completely unaware that her voice was carrying through the partially open door. Rowan sat perfectly still and listened as my mother conducted a hushed, incredibly tense phone call. Rowan memorized the exact words. Vanessa was speaking to a man named Preston Vale, a notorious real estate developer known for his ruthless acquisitions of historic waterfront properties. My mother was breathlessly reassuring him about a massive, high-stakes donor preview party. She promised him that the evening would be a spectacular success, a flawless networking event guaranteed to secure the necessary capital for his upcoming riverfront project. And then, Rowan heard the detail that made her blood run entirely cold. Vanessa confirmed that this crucial career-defining donor party was scheduled to take place on the exact same weekend as my wedding. At that specific moment, Rowan could not connect all the jagged edges of the picture. The logistics did not make logical sense. How could my mother possibly host a monumental real estate gala while simultaneously managing her daughter and a 200-person wedding? The timelines were fundamentally incompatible. But as Rowan sat there on the velvet sofa, listening to my mother murmur soothing promises to a wealthy developer, a dark, chilling realization settled deep in her chest. The excessive guest list filled with wealthy strangers, the aggressive hoarding of vendor contracts, the desperate, panicked push to relocate my reception to a different venue entirely. It was a meticulously crafted strategy. Rowan finally understood the terrifying truth. Vanessa was not just a controlling mother terrified that her daughter was marrying a man without a proper pedigree. Her motivations were entirely devoid of maternal concern. She did not just want to destroy my marriage to Everett. She actively needed my specific wedding date, my carefully chosen vendors, and my meticulously planned aesthetic for a completely different purpose. She was planning to steal the entire event, exactly 9 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. The very foundation of my meticulously planned life evaporated beneath my feet. It did not happen with a dramatic explosion or a loud confrontation. It began with an eerie, suffocating silence. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a Thursday evening, reviewing a timeline spreadsheet, when I realized the lead floral designer had completely ignored my messages. I had sent a polite text regarding the delivery bay access codes 48 hours prior. Nothing came back. I tried to call her studio line, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. A tiny knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Then, the venue coordinator at the Riverside Conservatory answered my call with a strange, clipped tone. Her voice lacked the warm, welcoming enthusiasm she had displayed for the past 10 months. She spoke in vague, evasive corporate circles, mentioning shifting logistical frameworks and asking for my patience while they reconciled their internal calendar. Less than 2 hours later, the catering manager sent a highly confusing email requesting to reconfirm some sudden changes that I had absolutely no knowledge of. I desperately tried to rationalize the chaos. I paced across my hardwood floors, loudly telling myself that this was simply the peak of the wedding season. Vendors were notoriously overworked during this time of year. They were juggling dozens of hysterical brides, double-booked weekends, and exhausted staff. I tried to convince my racing heart that the delays were merely administrative hiccups, the normal friction of planning a massive event. But Rowan was sitting on my living room sofa, watching my frantic pacing with dark, analyzing eyes. She did not believe in coincidences. In her high-stakes industry, a sudden cluster of communication breakdowns was never an accident. It was always a symptom of a systemic failure. She asked me to open my laptop and hand it over to her. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers fly across the keyboard as she accessed my inbox. She opened the confusing message from the catering manager and began dissecting it. With the cold precision of a forensic investigator, Rowan traced a terrifying digital breadcrumb trail. She scrolled past the current message, diving deep into the older, attached threads that the manager had accidentally forwarded in his haste. Suddenly, Rowan stopped typing. The color drained completely from her face. She slowly turned the glowing screen toward me. Buried at the very bottom of the chain was a formal cancellation confirmation. It was a sterile, automated message acknowledging the termination of our premium catering contract. The sender address was a private email handle I did not immediately recognize, but the signature block at the bottom was devastatingly clear. It read, Vanessa Lawrence, acting explicitly on behalf of the bride and her family. My breath caught in my throat as Rowan moved swiftly, using the direct emergency contacts she had secretly gathered months ago. She began making rapid, hushed phone calls from our balcony. When she stepped back inside 10 minutes later, the reality she delivered was absolute destruction. It was not just the catering. The Riverside Conservatory had been officially released back to the public market. The massive floral arrangements were canceled. The luxury shuttle buses meant to transport our guests, the 12-piece classical ensemble, the custom furniture rentals, and even the heavy linen deposits had all been fully liquidated. The entire infrastructure of my wedding had been systematically dismantled and refunded almost 1 full week prior. My mother had quietly burned my wedding to the ground while smiling at my face. A wave of pure physical nausea washed over me. I grabbed my phone. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was perfectly smooth, completely unbothered, as if she were answering a casual call about the weather. I screamed into the receiver. I demanded to know what she had done, how she could possibly justify destroying the most important day of my life behind my back. Vanessa did not stutter. She did not deny a single accusation. She did not even attempt to soften the blow. Her tone dropped into that chilling, authoritative register she reserved for unruly corporate subordinates. I stopped it before you turned your life into a public mistake, she said coldly. I stood frozen in my kitchen. The phone pressed hard against my ear, completely unable to process the sheer audacity of her cruelty. But the nightmare was not over. With the calculated precision of a sniper, Vanessa revealed her secondary strike. She wanted to ensure the bridge was not just burned, but completely pulverized. She calmly informed me that she had arranged a private phone call with Everett earlier that very afternoon. She told my future husband that I was fundamentally unstable under the severe pressure of event planning. She spun vicious lies, claiming I was wildly impulsive with money and secretly hiding massive financial debts. She told the man I loved that I possessed deep, unresolved psychological issues and was entirely unfit to build a sustainable, healthy marriage. The betrayal was a physical blow to my chest, stealing all the oxygen from the room. The loss of the vendors and the venue was a horrific logistical nightmare, but realizing my own mother had weaponized my most private vulnerabilities was a fatal strike to my soul. She had taken the quiet, painful moments of anxiety I had shared with her during my darkest periods of grief after my father died, and she had twisted them into a strategic negotiation tactic. She used my pain as ammunition to scare Everett away, viewing my mental well-being as nothing more than leverage in her sick social game. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and shattered against the tile floor. I collapsed onto my knees, burying my face in my hands, sobbing until my lungs burned and I could no longer breathe. I was utterly convinced that everything was gone. The beautiful wedding was erased. My professional and personal reputation was ruined, and Everett, I thought he would undoubtedly run. Who would possibly stay after hearing those venomous, terrifying lies from a mother warning a man about her own daughter? I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, drowning in the wreckage of my life, waiting for the inevitable text message from Everett ending our relationship. Then, the heavy front door of the apartment unlocked. Everett rushed inside. He did not look angry. He did not look scared or hesitant. He dropped his leather work bag right in the entryway, crossed the room in 3 massive strides, and fell to his knees beside me on the floor. He wrapped his strong, calloused arms tightly around my shaking shoulders and pulled me fiercely into his chest. I clung to his shirt, weeping uncontrollably. I tried to apologize through my gasping sobs. I tried to frantically explain the lies she had told him, desperate to defend my sanity and my character. Everett gently cupped my face with his hands, forcing me to look directly into his steady, unshakable eyes. He softly shushed my frantic apologies. He told me that he had listened to every single toxic word my mother had said on that phone call. He did not interrupt her. He let her speak her piece. Then, he stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that the poison she poured into his ear did not make him doubt me for a single second. Instead, the things she desperately wanted him to fear only made him see her true, manipulative nature with crystal clarity. He told me he knew exactly who I was. He knew my heart, my strength, and my integrity. He knew she was a liar playing a desperate game of control. I buried my face in his neck, the relief washing over me in agonizing waves, but the despair remained heavy in the room. I whispered into his collar that we had no venue, no food, no music, and no wedding. The entire day was completely erased from existence. My mother had won. That was when Rowan stood up from the kitchen stool. She had remained perfectly silent during my breakdown and Everett arriving, watching us with a fierce, protective intensity. She walked slowly over to the heavy oak coffee table. She did not offer empty platitudes or useless words of comfort. Instead, she dropped a massive, thick, unbranded physical folder right onto the wood. The satisfying, heavy slap of the cardboard hitting the table echoed loudly in the quiet living room. Rowan looked down at me, her eyes burning with a brilliant, terrifying professional determination. She delivered the single sentence that completely altered the trajectory of my entire life. I did not wait until today to prepare for the day she made her move. The morning after my world was completely dismantled, Everett drove me to the quiet outskirts of the city. We pulled into the driveway of a severe, beautifully maintained mid-century home belonging to his aunt, Celeste Hale. Celeste was a retired attorney, a formidable woman who had spent nearly 4 decades ruthlessly litigating massive contract disputes for international hospitality conglomerates. She was not the kind of woman who offered warm platitudes or baked goods in a crisis. She offered absolute, terrifying competence. We sat around her massive mahogany dining table while she meticulously reviewed the thick contingency binder Rowan had assembled. The air in the room was heavy and silent, save for the sharp rustle of thick paper and the scratch of Celeste taking notes with a silver fountain pen. She possessed a cold, analytical gaze that stripped away the emotional hysteria of the situation, reducing my mother and her betrayal to a series of actionable legal infractions. Celeste adjusted her reading glasses and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the venue cancellation addendum. She explained that my mother had not simply bullied a coordinator into releasing the date. Vanessa had actively committed fraud. Several of the digital cancellation requests bore electronic signatures that were designed to mimic my own authorization. My mother had bypassed the dual consent clauses entirely, exploiting the initial administrative control I had so foolishly handed over to her months prior. It was a calculated, deliberate falsification of digital records. But the deception went significantly deeper than forged signatures. Celeste turned her attention to the financial ledger, specifically the routing numbers tied to the refunded deposits. When a massive event is canceled, the released funds are legally required to return to the original source of payment. However, Celeste discovered that tens of thousands of dollars in refunded vendor retainers had been illegally diverted. The money did not go back into the shared account Everett and I had set up, nor did it return to my personal credit line. Instead, the funds had been expertly routed into a secondary account registered to the Magnolia Circle Arts League. The Magnolia Circle Arts League was a prominent local cultural fund where my mother currently sat on the executive board of directors. It was her primary arena for social climbing and networking among the city elite. Seeing that name on the financial documents was the key that unlocked the entire horrific mystery. Rowan, who had been aggressively working her industry contacts all morning from Celeste's guest bedroom, walked into the dining area with the final, damning piece of the puzzle. She had managed to get the former catering manager and the displaced floral designer on a secure conference call. They confessed everything. They admitted that my mother had not just canceled my wedding. She had aggressively renegotiated their contracts, strong-arming them into transferring their reserved labor and materials to a completely different event taking place on that exact same Saturday night. My vendors were being utilized to cater and decorate a lavish donor preview gala for Preston Vale and his highly anticipated riverfront real estate development. My mother had effectively stolen my entire aesthetic, my culinary menu, and my carefully curated atmosphere to serve as the backdrop for a high society networking event. The sheer scale of the manipulation forced me to look at my mother through a completely new, horrifying lens. I dug into her recent financial history, making a few discreet calls to old family acquaintances in the retail sector. The truth was pathetic and devastating. The exclusive high-end luxury boutique my mother had operated for over a decade had quietly collapsed into bankruptcy almost 18 months ago. She was completely drowning in mounting debt and desperately losing her iron grip on her elevated social standing. Vanessa needed a miraculous, high-profile social comeback to secure her position among the wealthy donors and investors of the city. She needed to prove to men like Preston Vale that she was still a power player capable of orchestrating magnificent, exclusive gatherings. But she had absolutely no capital left to fund such an extravagant event herself. Suddenly, her intense, suffocating interest in my wedding made perfect, terrifying sense. In the cold, calculating eyes of Vanessa Lawrence, my intimate, emotionally resonant celebration was not a milestone of my happiness. It was a profoundly wasted opportunity. I was spending valuable resources on a quiet, private union with a restoration architect, instead of leveraging the event to impress the local aristocracy. She did not sabotage my marriage because she believed Everett was unworthy, or because she possessed a toxic, misguided form of maternal protection. The truth was infinitely colder and much harder to survive. She destroyed my wedding simply because she viewed me as an expendable public relations asset. She looked at my happiness and saw only a budget she could misappropriate to save her own fading reputation. She cannibalized her only daughter to keep herself warm. The shock of that realization did not make me cry. It completely eradicated my capacity for tears. A freezing, hard clarity settled into the marrow of my bones. I was no longer a grieving bride mourning the loss of a beautiful day. I was a woman who had just been robbed by a desperate con artist wearing my mother's mask. There was, however, one massive miscalculation in my mother and her flawless strategy. She had treated the vendors like easily manipulated pawns, threatening to ruin their local reputations if they did not comply with her aggressive demands to pivot to the corporate gala. The vendors were absolutely furious. Independent creatives in the hospitality industry despise being bullied by wealthy socialites. The catering manager, the lead florist, and the venue coordinator were deeply disgusted by the hostility and the unethical financial routing they had been forced into. They had originally stayed silent out of fear and professional preservation, believing I was a compliant participant in the family drama. But once Rowan explained the reality of the forged signatures and the stolen funds, their fear transformed into righteous anger. They explicitly told Rowan that they were completely willing to stand by my side. They promised to provide sworn affidavits confirming Vanessa and her coercion and fraudulent instructions if this situation ever escalated into a courtroom. I looked across the table at Everett. He was staring at the forged documents, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He reached out and placed his large, steady hand over mine. I looked at Celeste, who was already organizing the evidence into chronological legal files, preparing the ammunition. And I looked at Rowan, who possessed the fierce, predatory gleam of a woman ready to execute a flawless counteroffensive. My mother thought she had successfully burned my world to ash. She firmly believed she had left me crying in the dark, completely powerless and thoroughly defeated. She thought she had secured her grand social triumph using the stolen bones of my wedding. She had absolutely no idea what was coming for her. The air in Celeste Hale's dining room was razor thin as we plotted our next move. My immediate instinct, fueled by raw adrenaline and agonizing betrayal, was to drive straight to my mother and her townhouse and tear the walls down. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords bled. But Celeste calmly reached across the mahogany table and placed a firm hand over my trembling fingers. She explicitly forbade any immediate confrontation. Her logic was cold, calculated, and absolutely flawless. If Vanessa suspected for even one fraction of a second that we had uncovered her massive financial fraud, she would immediately pivot. She would scramble to erase the digital trails, shred the remaining physical documents, and potentially launch a secondary strike to locate and destroy our backup plan. To execute this counteroffensive properly, we had to play dead. My mother needed to believe her devastating sabotage was a total, undisputed victory. Rowan did not waste a single breath. She pulled out her mobile phone and officially activated Harbor Ledger Hall. The soft hold was instantly converted into an ironclad booking. In that specific moment, the massive converted ferry terminal stopped being a mere life raft to keep us from drowning. It transformed into a heavily fortified staging ground. We were no longer scrambling to save a ruined day. We were engineering a spectacular reversal of fortune. The momentum shifted violently from despair to pure, high-octane mission setup. Rowan mobilized her ghost vendors with terrifying efficiency. The independent executive chef, an absolute culinary genius who owed Rowan his career, completely scrapped the original catering concept. He took the foundational idea of honoring my late father and his favorite meals and elevated it to an entirely new stratosphere. He designed a fiercely authentic, highly refined coastal menu featuring open-fire roasting and local catches, discarding the stiff, pretentious country club plating my mother had originally demanded. The backup floral designer followed suit. She took one look at the canceled order of imported, sterile white orchids and laughed. Instead, she brought in the wild, untamed soul of the deep southern swamplands. She sourced massive quantities of creeping smilax, thick curtains of silver Spanish moss, and vibrant, deeply textured palmetto fronds. The new aesthetic was beautifully raw and incredibly grounding. It possessed a powerful, living heartbeat that the original, highly manicured design severely lacked. While the physical space was being aggressively transformed, we faced our most dangerous logistical hurdle. We had to redirect the guests without triggering a public alarm. Mara Hale stepped up, treating the complex guest list like a classified military operation. She ruthlessly purged the wealthy strangers and corporate donors my mother had forced upon us, stripping the headcount right back down to our original, cherished circle of 90 people. Mara then divided those 90 individuals into highly secure micro-factions. She refused to use mass emails or sprawling group chats, knowing those were practically breeding grounds for information leaks. Instead, she drafted individually tailored, highly personalized text messages. She contacted each guest directly, spinning a flawless narrative about an exclusive last-minute venue upgrade for enhanced privacy. Everett ran point on the physical movement of the crowd. He operated with the quiet, brilliant precision of the architect he was. He mapped out staggered arrival windows to prevent a sudden bottleneck of luxury cars. He secured a private fleet of unmarked black shuttles for the out-of-town relatives. He even designed a complex parking grid that kept all arriving vehicles completely hidden from the main waterfront thoroughfare, until the exact moment the guests needed to step inside the hall. He was orchestrating the invisible movement of nearly 100 people, ensuring they vanished from the public eye and reappeared securely within our fortress. My specific assignment was the hardest of all. I had to master the agonizing art of complete silence. I locked down my entire digital footprint. I posted absolutely nothing on my social media feeds. I deliberately ignored the incoming phone calls from my mother and her wealthy socialite friends, women who were undoubtedly fishing for tragic gossip to share over their afternoon martinis. I forced myself to sit in the quiet dark, letting Vanessa luxuriate in her stolen triumph. Completely convinced I was broken, behind the scenes, Celeste was methodically constructing a legal guillotine. She transformed the dining room table into a war room, arranging every single piece of incriminating evidence in strict chronological order. She printed out the fraudulent cancellation orders bearing my forged electronic signatures. She highlighted the exact banking routing numbers that proved the refunded venue deposits had been illegally funneled directly into the Magnolia Circle Arts League accounts. She compiled the recorded audio statements and sworn affidavits from the furious original vendors. It was an airtight, devastatingly precise timeline of financial theft and emotional manipulation. As the chaotic hours blurred into a frantic countdown, a profound shift occurred deep within my chest. The paralyzing grief evaporated, replaced by a surging electric current of excitement. The more I watched this shadow operation come to life, the more I realized a beautiful truth. This second wedding, born out of pure chaos and fierce loyalty, actually looked exactly like the woman I was. It was completely stripped of artificial high society posturing. It was gritty, deeply intentional, and overflowing with authentic life. Everett and I were building something real, defended by people who truly loved us. But the air remained thick with an undeniable, suffocating risk. The entire counteroffensive was balanced on the absolute edge of a razor. We were coordinating dozens of moving parts, relying heavily on the absolute discretion of every single person involved. All it would take was one tiny mistake. If a single gossiping aunt accidentally forwarded Mara and her secure text message to the wrong family member, or if a loose-lipped vendor casually mentioned the Harbor Ledger Hall address to one of my mother and her elite acquaintances just 24 hours too early, the entire operation would instantly collapse. Vanessa still possessed the social power and the vicious desperation to launch one final, fatal strike. If she found out where we were hiding, she had the capacity to march right through those industrial doors and burn my beautiful, newly built world straight to the ground. When the initial shock finally burned itself out, it left behind a quiet, hollow clarity. I spent hours sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the blank wall, sifting through 31 years of childhood memories. I finally understood that my mother had never actually been trying to build a nurturing family environment. She had always been directing a highly controlled stage play. Growing up, our home was always a fortress of immaculate aesthetics, designed specifically to hide the deep, vibrating insecurities she carried inside her chest. Every holiday dinner, every social gathering, every single family photograph was heavily curated to project absolute perfection to the outside world. I remembered my father, a man who possessed a quiet, gentle soul that often clashed violently with her rigid social ambitions. I vividly recalled sitting on the back porch with him when I was 12 years old, watching him whittle a small piece of pine wood. He had looked at me with warm, deeply tired eyes and told me that real love always leaves room for you to breathe. That single, profound sentence became the ultimate antithesis of the way Vanessa Lawrence chose to love. Her version of love was a tight vacuum, designed to suck all the oxygen out of the room until you had absolutely no choice but to rely entirely on her to survive. There were fleeting, desperate moments during that agonizing week when I wanted to surrender entirely to the exhaustion. I wanted to tell Rowan to cancel the backup venue, tell Celeste to drop the legal files, and just run far away. I fantasized about grabbing Everett by the hand, driving straight to the local courthouse, and signing the marriage certificate in total silence without a single guest present. It would have been so incredibly easy to just vanish and elope in the shadows. but sitting in the dim light of my living room, watching the city traffic below, I realized that shrinking my joy was exactly what my mother expected me to do. If I ran away to get married in secret, I would still be allowing her to dictate the exact scale and shape of my happiness. I would be conceding a massive defeat. Everett saw the heavy exhaustion weighing on my shoulders, yet he never once demanded that I fight back or be resilient. He did not puff out his chest and try to play the aggressive, masculine savior. He simply sat beside me on the sofa, poured me a cup of hot tea, and silently anchored me to the present moment. He did not push me to be fiercely independent when I felt completely broken inside. He just made it entirely clear that whichever path I chose to walk down, he would be walking right next to me. His quiet, unshakable solidarity made our relationship feel infinitely more profound and convincing than any grand, theatrical declaration of romance ever could. I knew exactly what I had to do to reclaim my autonomy. I picked up my mobile phone and drafted a text message to my mother. I did not write a lengthy, emotional essay begging for her to explain her cruelty. I did not hurl vicious insults or explicitly threaten the legal action Celeste was currently preparing. I kept the message brutally short and perfectly clear. I informed her that effective immediately, she was permanently stripped of all involvement in my wedding. I stated explicitly that she no longer possessed any authority whatsoever to make decisions on my behalf, and she was strictly forbidden from contacting any vendors under the guise of representing our family. I pressed send and immediately blocked her number. I did not feel a sudden, cinematic rush of vindication. I just felt an immense, terrifying weight physically drop from my chest. Vanessa, staying entirely true to her manipulative nature, did not simply accept defeat and retreat into the shadows to reflect on her actions. The very moment she received my message, she immediately pivoted to a highly aggressive counter-strategy. She launched a massive, coordinated communication campaign targeting our extended family members. She spent hours on the phone with aunts, uncles, and distant cousins, speaking in hushed, incredibly dramatic tones. She planted toxic seeds of doubt across the family tree, vaguely hinting that the wedding was currently experiencing severe private issues. She painted a vivid picture of me as a hysterical, deeply unstable bride who was simply too emotional to make rational decisions for her own future. She expertly framed her hostile takeover as a desperate, necessary intervention by a deeply concerned parent trying to save her beloved child from a catastrophic public mistake. The poison worked exactly as she intended on certain members of the family. Over the next 48 hours, I received several voicemails from relatives adopting that same infuriating, patronizing tone my mother frequently used. They gently suggested I postpone the ceremony, advising me to take a few months to clear my head and listen to the wisdom of my mother. Every single message felt like a sharp physical blow to my ribs. It was agonizing to realize how easily these people who had known me my entire life, were willing to believe a false narrative that painted me as wildly incompetent. But that sharp, biting pain eventually gave way to a powerful, illuminating sense of liberation. My mother had inadvertently handed me a massive, unexpected gift. By forcing the family to choose sides based entirely on her vicious lies, she completely illuminated exactly who actually belonged in my life and who was merely occupying space. I made a conscious, difficult decision right then and there in my kitchen. I absolutely refused to spend my precious energy trying to defend my sanity or explain the complicated, ugly truth to people who demanded perfect evidence to believe me. I completely stopped returning the skeptical phone calls. I stopped trying to manage the vicious rumors currently spreading through the wealthy social circles of Charleston. Instead, I poured every single ounce of my remaining spirit into the people who were actually standing right in front of me. I invested my heart entirely into the friends and the newly chosen family who showed up at Harbor Ledger Hall without asking a single exhausting question. I focused my attention on Rowan, who was busy directing the lighting crew with absolute authority. I focused on Mara, who was carefully transporting heavy boxes of wild palmetto fronds without a single complaint. I focused on Everett, who was currently helping the venue staff unfold heavy wooden chairs and align them perfectly facing the dark river outside. I stood in the center of that massive, beautifully raw industrial hall, watching the people who truly loved me work tirelessly to build a sanctuary out of the bitter ashes my mother had left behind. The suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for 10 long months completely evaporated into the humid evening air. I realized I was doing much more than merely organizing a revised wedding ceremony. I was fortifying my own soul. I was drawing a permanent, impenetrable boundary line in the sand. For the first time in my entire 31 years of existence, I was not just preparing to walk down an aisle. I was actively preparing to look my mother directly in the eyes, say the word no directly to her face, and absolutely refuse to offer a single apology for choosing to live my own life. Exactly 24 hours before I was meant to walk down the aisle, the air crackled with a suffocating electric tension. We were operating out of a cramped back office at Harbor Ledger Hall when Rowan received a text message from a trusted industry contact. The blood drained from her face as she read the words aloud. My mother was not simply sitting at home, reveling in her presumed victory. She was currently standing inside the Riverside Conservatory, hosting an exclusive closed-door cocktail hour to butter up the deep-pocketed investors for Preston Vale. But the absolute worst part was the aesthetic. Rowan and her contact managed to snap a blurry photograph and send it over. I stared at the glowing screen, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. Vanessa had shamelessly stolen my exact design concept. The specific ambient lighting, the draped linens, and the spatial arrangement I had painstakingly crafted for months were all on full display. She was walking around the room, clutching a crystal flute of expensive champagne, accepting lavish compliments for her supposedly brilliant eye for event design. She was wearing my stolen dream like a cheap accessory. Worse still was the narrative she was peddling to the wealthy donors. She was overheard adopting a tragic, sorrowful tone, telling a prominent city councilman that her poor daughter was simply not mentally equipped for the heavy burdens of a lifelong commitment. She painted herself as the brave, responsible matriarch who had to step in and intervene before I made a catastrophic public mistake. She was destroying my character while serving expensive hors d'oeuvres on my dime. A hot, violent wave of pure rage washed over me. I grabbed my car keys, fully intending to drive across town and tear the glass house apart with my bare hands. But Celeste Hale stepped directly into my path, her imposing figure blocking the door. She did not raise her voice, but her command was absolute. She ordered me to stand down. Celeste understood the psychology of warfare far better than I did. She explained that if I stormed in there screaming, I would look exactly like the hysterical, unstable woman Vanessa was claiming I was. More importantly, Celeste wanted my mother to remain completely intoxicated by her own arrogance. An opponent who believes she has already won is an opponent who leaves her flanks completely exposed. Celeste wanted Vanessa to feel so untouchable that she would inevitably show up somewhere she absolutely did not belong. So, we channeled that burning fury into meticulous, terrifying preparation. We transformed the back office into a legal war room. We printed out 6 complete hard copy sets of the fraudulent vendor cancellation forms. We neatly highlighted the forged electronic signatures and the illegal bank routing numbers that proved she had diverted the refunded deposits into her own charity accounts. We loaded every single piece of digital evidence onto multiple encrypted flash drives, distributing them among trusted members of the bridal party. We were not just preparing for a wedding ceremony anymore. We were arming a highly sophisticated legal trap. The beautiful poetic irony of the situation was the guest list itself. Vanessa was currently at the conservatory, desperately trying to woo the city elite. She had absolutely no idea that several of the most powerful, influential figures in the local donor circle were actually related to Everett by marriage. Those key individuals, the exact people my mother needed to impress to save her failing social standing, were securely on our finalized guest list for tomorrow evening. They were going to be sitting in our audience, not hers. To solidify the trap, Rowan secured the ultimate wild card. The original catering manager, still burning with furious resentment over being blackmailed and financially strong-armed by my mother, agreed to a massive favor. He promised to slip away from the corporate gala tomorrow night, put on a dark suit, and attend our ceremony in person. He was prepared to step out of the shadows and serve as a direct eyewitness to her extortion if the situation detonated. Just as we finalized the evidentiary binders, the building shuddered violently. A massive crack of thunder rattled the heavy industrial windows of the ferry terminal. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the coastal weather took a severe, dangerous turn. The local meteorological service issued a sudden advisory for the entire riverfront area, warning of torrential downpours and punishing gale-force winds expected to strike precisely during our arrival window the following night. My heart plummeted into my shoes. The entire logistical entry plan relied on an open, uncovered pathway along the historic wooden docks. The storm threatened to ruin everything, forcing our guests to arrive soaked and freezing. The stress, already pushed to the absolute breaking point, instantly doubled. But what happened next completely redefined my understanding of love. Nobody panicked. Nobody complained about the horrific timing. Instead, a fierce, unified energy swept through the room. Everett immediately threw on a heavy waterproof jacket, marching out into the blinding rain to physically measure a new entry route through the covered side loading bays. Mara grabbed a dry erase marker and began frantically redrawing the valet parking grid on a massive whiteboard, ensuring vehicles could pull directly under the steel awnings. Rowan spent 45 solid minutes negotiating aggressively on the phone with a local warehouse manager, successfully securing 3 heavy-duty canvas tunnels to connect the drop-off zone to the main entrance. I stood in the center of the chaotic, dimly lit room, watching my fiancé wipe rain from his eyes as he carried heavy steel barricades. I watched my best friend bark orders into a phone, and my future sister-in-law meticulously reroute traffic flows. They were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and fighting a literal storm for me. I did not feel defeated. For the first time in my life, I felt the profound, unshakable security of a family built not on blood and toxic obligation, but on fierce, unwavering choice. We were a machine operating on pure devotion. We finally finished the emergency pivot long past midnight. The rain was still hammering against the roof, but the venue was secure. We collapsed onto a pile of unused shipping crates, eating cold pizza in comfortable, exhausted silence. We thought we had covered every single vulnerability. We thought we had locked every door. We were wrong. The fatal breach did not happen because of a vendor leak or a logistical failure. It happened in the lobby of a downtown luxury hotel. An older, notoriously talkative cousin of mine had flown in from out of state. She was one of the few extended relatives who had initially bought into my mother and her tragic narrative, but Mara had successfully convinced her to attend what she thought was a small, somber, private dinner. After checking into her room, the cousin went down to the hotel bar for a glass of wine. There, she bumped into a prominent member of the Magnolia Circle Arts League, a woman who worked closely with my mother. They exchanged pleasantries, and the cousin, having absolutely no understanding of the covert war being waged, casually lamented the terrible storm outside. She sighed heavily and loudly proclaimed that it was a terrible shame about the rain. Considering Camille was still stubbornly pushing forward with her wedding tomorrow night down at the old ferry terminal, the charity board member froze, her eyes widening in pure shock, miles away. As I was finally closing my eyes to get a few hours of sleep, my mother was standing in her immaculate townhouse. Her mobile phone began to ring, glowing brightly in the dark. Someone was calling to inform Vanessa Lawrence that her daughter was not broken, the wedding was not dead, and she was currently reigning over a completely empty kingdom. When Saturday evening finally arrived, Harbor Ledger Hall did not look like a frantic backup plan. It looked like an absolute revelation. The brutal coastal storm from the previous night had washed the city completely clean, leaving behind a crisp, deeply still twilight. Inside the massive converted ferry terminal, the aesthetic was nothing short of cinematic. Hundreds of small copper lanterns hung suspended from the heavy steel rafters, casting a brilliant, warm amber glow that reflected flawlessly off the dark, moving water of the river right outside the floor-to-ceiling glass panes. Soft, Sheer white curtains billowed gently against the exposed brick walls, catching the delicate twinkle of countless strung fairy lights. A live jazz trio played a slow, incredibly soulful melody in the corner, the rich notes of the saxophone wrapping the cavernous room in an undeniable, intimate warmth. Long, elegant wooden banquet tables stretched across the polished concrete floor, completely devoid of the stiff, towering centerpieces my mother had demanded. As our 90 guests began to filter through the heavy industrial doors, I watched their faces from a concealed bridal suite perched on the second-floor mezzanine. Many of them arrived carrying a distinct, nervous energy. They had heard the vicious rumors circulating over the past 48 hours. They walked in expecting to find a tragic, hastily assembled disaster, or a bride on the verge of a total psychological collapse. Instead, they stopped dead in their tracks, entirely captivated. They instantly recognized that they were not witnessing a compromised version of my wedding. They were standing inside a profoundly elevated, brutally honest realization of exactly what this day was always meant to be. The very elements my mother had viciously mocked as being too personal or completely lacking in high society polish were the exact things that gave the evening its soul. The signature cocktails were named after the beloved summer porch drinks my late father used to make. The atmosphere was unpretentious, deeply grounded, and so overwhelmingly full of genuine love that several guests were visibly moved to tears before the ceremony even officially commenced. Down on the main floor, Rowan was operating with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a master stage director. She wore a sleek emerald gown, communicating through a discreet earpiece with the venue staff, ensuring every single guest found their assigned seat with absolute perfection. She was the invisible architect of the evening flow. Seated quietly in the second row, Celeste Hale looked entirely unbothered. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, sipping sparkling water with the terrifying, serene composure of a grandmaster who had already seen checkmate 12 moves in advance. Celeste knew the beautiful ceremony was just the prelude. The true climax of the evening was still waiting in the wings. The jazz trio smoothly transitioned into a slow, acoustic instrumental piece, signaling the beginning of the processional. The room fell into a heavy, respectful hush. Just as the massive double doors at the back of the hall were supposed to close, they swung open wide. Vanessa Lawrence stepped directly into the threshold. She was dressed for a complete slaughter. She wore a breathtaking, deeply expensive midnight blue evening gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, her posture radiating absolute authority. She walked in wearing the exact facial expression of a woman who fully expected to survey a kingdom she had successfully burned to the ground. She thought she was going to find me weeping in a corner, surrounded by folding chairs and utter humiliation. She had likely rushed over the second she received the phone call from her gossiping informant, eager to play the role of the rescuing savior in front of my ruined audience. But the devastating smirk completely vanished from her face the second her eyes adjusted to the warm copper lighting. She stopped moving, her expensive high heels frozen to the concrete floor. She looked down the long, beautiful aisle lined with wild palmetto fronds. She saw Everett standing tall and impossibly handsome at the altar, looking at the mezzanine with absolute devotion. She saw the sheer elegance of the space, the flawless execution of the lighting, and the overwhelming sense of peace radiating from the crowd. She did not see a disaster. She saw a masterpiece she had absolutely no part in creating. Then, the true horror of her miscalculation struck her. As Vanessa scanned the seated audience, her gaze snagged on the third row. Sitting right there, smiling warmly and holding a program, were three of the most prominent, incredibly wealthy donor couples in the entire city. These were the exact same real estate investors and cultural financiers she had been desperately trying to court at her fake, stolen preview party across town. She had completely failed to realize that their deep generational ties to the Hale family guaranteed their presence here tonight. My mother was standing in the back of my wedding, making agonizing eye contact with the very people she needed to save her sinking social status, and they were looking at her with total confusion. Driven by pure, desperate instinct, Vanessa took a sharp step forward. She clearly intended to march right down the center aisle, perhaps to grab a microphone, cause a massive scene, or somehow reclaim control of the narrative by sheer force of will. She would never simply surrender. But before she could take a second step, a towering, broad-shouldered security professional in a dark suit stepped seamlessly out of the shadows. He did not yell or create a physical altercation. He simply moved his massive frame directly into her path, crossing his arms and offering a polite, icy smile. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into her ear, gesturing firmly toward the back wall. He forced her to step out of the aisle and stand in the deep shadows near the coat check. She was physically trapped, completely neutralized, and forced to endure the absolute torture of watching the entire event unfold without possessing the power to touch a single detail. The acoustic music swelled. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine staircase and began my walk down the aisle. The heavy white silk of my dress caught the amber light, making me feel brilliantly illuminated. Halfway down the path, my eyes caught movement in the back corner of the room. I saw my mother standing there, flanked by the security guard, her face a rigid mask of fury and utter defeat. For a split second, my heart skipped a frantic beat. The familiar, deeply ingrained childhood terror flared in my chest. But then I looked forward. I looked at Everett, who was smiling at me with a love so solid it could move mountains. I looked at the faces of my chosen family, beaming with pride and fierce loyalty. I did not look back at the shadows again. I reached the altar, took Everett by the hands, and spoke my vows into the quiet, listening room. I did not stutter. I did not rush. I spoke with the clear, ringing voice of a woman who had finally claimed ownership of her own life. When Everett kissed me and the officiant proudly pronounced us husband and wife, the entire hall erupted into a deafening, thunderous wave of applause. The cheers echoed off the exposed brick and rolled right to the back of the room, crashing over Vanessa. In that roaring, joyful noise, my mother finally realized the absolute terrifying truth. She had deployed every single manipulative weapon in her arsenal, and she had completely failed to isolate me. She had not broken me. She had only built me a stronger castle. After the final plates of the exquisite coastal dinner were cleared, a soft lull settled over Harbor Ledger Hall. The jazz trio had paused their set, and people were murmuring happily, their glasses filled with champagne for the upcoming toasts. That was the exact moment my mother decided she could no longer endure her forced obsolescence. She slipped past the security detail during a shift change near the catering entrance and marched purposefully toward the small wooden stage. Before the best man could even reach for the microphone stand, Vanessa snatched the polished silver microphone from its cradle. The sudden feedback emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine that instantly silenced the entire room of 90 guests. She stood there in her midnight blue evening gown, her chin raised high, projecting the devastating aura of a tragic matriarch. She tapped the microphone twice and announced that a mother needed to say a few words before it was entirely too late. She did not sound apologetic. She launched into her familiar, highly practiced routine of moral superiority. Her voice echoed off the exposed brick as she addressed the silent crowd, expertly painting herself as the agonizingly devoted parent. She stated that every single harsh decision she had made over the past 10 months was done exclusively to protect her only daughter from a catastrophic, impulsive mistake. She looked directly at Everett and me, seated at our sweetheart table, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. Then, she delivered her crowning lie. She proudly proclaimed to the room of wealthy donors and quiet family members that she had personally shouldered the vast majority of the financial costs for this event, implying that without her immense generosity, we would have absolutely nothing. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the heavy air. A year ago, I would have shrunk into my chair. I would have let her dictate the narrative to avoid a public scene. But sitting beside my husband, I felt absolutely nothing but cold. Crystalline clarity. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stood up from my chair, smoothed the heavy silk of my wedding dress, and walked slowly toward the stage. I stepped up beside her. I did not try to wrestle the microphone from her grip. I simply held out my open palm and waited. For a fraction of a second, Vanessa hesitated, but the crushing weight of nearly 200 eyes watching her forced her to yield. She handed it over. I turned to the audience, my voice steady and completely calm. I thanked every single person who had worked tirelessly over the past 48 hours to rebuild this beautiful day from the ashes. I looked at Rowan, Mara, and Everett. Then, I turned my head slightly to look at my mother. I told the room that there was still one unfinished piece to this story, and I thought everyone needed to know exactly what it was. Right on cue, Celeste Hale stood up from the second row. She did not bring a glass of champagne. She brought the thick, heavily tabbed evidentiary binder. She walked to the center of the dance floor, projecting her voice with the terrifying, practiced resonance of a seasoned litigator. She addressed the room, explicitly turning her attention toward the tables where the prominent city council members and real estate investors were seated. Celeste announced, with absolute factual precision, that Vanessa Lawrence had not paid for a single element of this evening. Instead, Celeste revealed that Vanessa had actively committed fraud by forging electronic signatures to cancel our original venue and vendors, illegally stripping away thousands of dollars in deposits that did not belong to her. Vanessa gasped loudly, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She opened her mouth to shout a denial, to call Celeste a liar, but the trap had already been perfectly sprung. From the back of the room, near the shadows of the bar, the original catering manager stepped forward. He was wearing the dark suit he promised, looking incredibly sharp and profoundly furious. He raised his hand and spoke loudly, confirming everything. He testified right then and there that Vanessa had aggressively strong-armed his business, threatening his professional reputation if he did not cancel my wedding contract. He explicitly stated that she claimed to be the sole legal financial representative of the bride, using that fabricated authority to force him into serving a completely different event taking place that exact same night. The room was completely paralyzed in shock, but Celeste was not finished. She delivered the final, fatal blow. She opened a specific folder and read the banking routing numbers aloud. She explained that the illegally refunded vendor deposits were not returned to my account. They were expertly diverted into the financial accounts of the Magnolia Circle Arts League. Celeste then connected the final dot, revealing that my mother had stolen my wedding infrastructure specifically to cater a lavish donor preview gala for Preston Vale, attempting to use my ruined day as a stepping stone to salvage her own bankrupt social standing. When the name of the charity organization and the real estate developer dropped into the silent room, the atmosphere shifted violently. The wealthy sponsors and key cultural financiers seated in the audience physically recoiled. They instantly realized they were not just hearing family drama. They were listening to a direct admission of severe financial misappropriation and profound ethical bankruptcy. The gala they were supposed to be funding was being built on stolen money, before my mother could even attempt to formulate a desperate lie. Helen Dorsey stood up. Helen was a highly respected elder in the Hale family, but more importantly, she was the sitting treasurer of the exact same arts council my mother was using to climb the social ladder. Helen looked at Vanessa with an expression of absolute, freezing disgust. She did not yell. Her voice was quiet, dripping with aristocratic contempt. Helen stated clearly that effective immediately, Vanessa was strictly forbidden from operating any fund activities, managing any charity accounts, or attending any board meetings until external legal counsel conducted a thorough forensic audit of the organization. Vanessa physically staggered backward, her expensive high heels slipping slightly on the polished concrete floor. She looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. She looked at her relatives, her wealthy acquaintances, and finally, at me. But she found absolutely nothing. For the very first time in her entirely manufactured life, she had completely lost control of the room. Every single eye staring back at her communicated the exact same devastating truth. She was no longer the brave, self-sacrificing mother. She was fully exposed as a desperate, manipulative woman who viewed her own daughter as nothing more than an expendable social asset. Two tall security professionals seamlessly materialized at the edge of the stage. They did not touch her, but their presence was an absolute, Undeniable mandate. They politely extended their arms, directing her toward the side exit leading to the dark alleyway. Vanessa stepped down from the stage. She was forced to walk the long, agonizing distance toward the heavy iron doors. She walked past the wild palmetto fronds she had tried to cancel. She walked under the warm copper lighting she had tried to extinguish. She walked past the beautiful, towering tables of food she had tried to steal. The silence in the cavernous room was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that the click of her heels sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. It was a silence infinitely more punishing than any screaming match or shouted insult could have ever been. When the heavy door finally clicked shut behind her, a collective, massive exhale swept through the entire room. The dark cloud had been entirely excised. Everett walked over to me, wrapping his strong, steady arms around my waist. The jazz trio, recognizing the exact moment the air cleared, smoothly transitioned into a slow, incredibly tender melody. We walked to the center of the dance floor for our first dance. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. I looked out at the glowing room, at Rowan smiling widely, at Mara lifting a glass of champagne, and at Celeste nodding slightly in quiet approval. As we swayed slowly beside the dark, moving river, I finally realized the absolute truth of what had just happened. The thing my mother walked into was not simply a wedding that had managed to survive her sabotage. She had walked straight into an impenetrable fortress of truth, surrounded by an entire room full of witnesses and authentic, unwavering love. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had finally grown up enough to realize I never needed her permission to begin my own life. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can chat and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.